A bucket of water hit like a thrown sentence, brief, loud, impossible to ignore. Cold sheets of it splashed down the thin shawl around a woman's shoulders, drenched the coarse blanket wrapped around a baby, and sent a small, shocked wail into the narrow street. For a moment, everything centered on that sound. The baby's thin breath, the slap of water on concrete, the soft scuff of a sandal as a neighbor stepped forward. Above them, on the polished balcony with its iron scrollwork and potted geraniums, a woman in white smoothed her gloves and smiled as if she had folded a thought into action. Lupita stood motionless, the infant in her arms trembling against her chest. The water ran from the baby's dark hair into the cracked pavement, carrying with it the last of the morning's dough from her apron, the dust from her hands, the fragile dignity she had been holding together since dawn. For 2 heartbeats she looked up, not with a sharp retort, not with pleading, but simply with a weariness that had been forged by months of empty replies. Then the cry doubled, rawer now, and she tucked the little one closer as if warmth could erase the bite of that cold splash. Around her, the street knit itself into a familiar pattern. Doors opening a crack, faces peering out, some with curiosity, some with the practiced indifference of those who live too near their own worries to spend too long on other people's pain. An old woman shuffled across the threshold of a doorway and, without asking, shoved a towel into Lupita's hands. Another neighbor crossed herself. A man cursed quietly and stepped back into the shade. The street smelled of frying oil and laundry soap, and the 2-note music someone always played from a transistor radio. Life arranged itself as it always did, as if this had been nothing more than a gust of wind. But the sight of Doña Estela's hand flattening down on the balustrade, the way she bent to speak into the empty phone as if registering her triumphs, those small theatrics stuck where they could be painful. She had the kind of face that had been smoothed by money and still wore the imprint of an old hurt. She had the luxury of laughter practiced in private and cruelty practiced in public. People said she exercised her pride like a muscle, flexing it in gestures that made even the quirks of the building seem curated. Lupita was not new to humiliation. She had learned to move through it like a quiet tide. Motherhood, poverty, the expectation to smile through things, those had been her teachers. But being soaked in front of her children and neighbors felt like an exposure of more than the wet fabric. It was a revelation of how the world measured worth by the thickness of a purse and the polish of a floor. Her name was Guadalupe Reyes, but everyone called her Lupita because it fit against her small laugh and the way she tucked stray curls behind her ear. She lived on the ground floor of a building that sagged like an old ship, 2 rooms that kept heat in the summer and left a permanent dampness in the winter. Ramiro, her husband, worked irregular jobs. A day hauling crates in the market, another day patching roofs. The kind of labor that paid in coins and in favors. Their apartment smelled of lentils and damp cloth diapers. There were toys carved from bottle caps, 2 small shirts mended with patience, and a Bible with pages long softened by prayer and by the rhythm of thumbed corners. Carlitos was 5 months old, small and dark-haired, with lashes that would gather every careless sunlight and make it a thing to marvel at. Anita, 6, braided her hair every morning with the precision of a ritual. Pedrito, 4, thought of the world as a string of daring things to be done, to jump puddles, to rescue lost cats, to beat the clock that always threatened to swallow dinner. Lupita walked these small battlegrounds with the steady steps of someone who had learned to keep panic for nights and patience for days. She had been arriving to a neighbor's door that morning with a basket of bread she had found discounted at the bakery, hoping to trade for a few minutes of work. She had expected maybe a glance, perhaps a tossed excuse. She had not expected a hand to push her away, to send cold water across her shoulders like an instrument of humiliation. The baby's cry was small, yes, but sharp enough to locate every eye. But something else happened too, not dramatic, not immediate. It was the small flutters of solidarity that stitched neighborhoods together. Doña Chuy dropping a spare tortilla into Lupita's basket later that day. A baby blanket borrowed and returned, smelling faintly of lavender. A neighbor telling a story of someone once helped by the old woman who never let anyone borrow her car. Those gestures do not undo a slapped dignity, not by themselves. They are like tiny stitches in cloth that cannot be seen from a distance. Yet they matter. They had always mattered to Lupita. Outside the apartment with the balcony, Doña Estela Villalobos closed the door only after she had seen the last of the spectacle. She went inside with a satisfied tilt to her head, as if she had performed a small correct action in the theater of her life. Her house was a study in pale marbles and imported lamps, in carefully curated loneliness. She kept cut flowers on the table more for the look of life than for the scent. She kept letters in drawers unread so that distance could remain intact. In the eyes of the neighborhood, she was the woman who could throw cold water and not be touched by consequence. But solitude has corners that pry into the most gilded rooms. Inside, she placed her gloved hand over the remaining fabric of her gown and, in the privacy of a recliner, let a memory rear up unbidden. A memory of a small girl whose mother had once stood on a low stool to let a bucket of water fall too quickly and who had watched people look away. The memory didn't soften her, it armored her, teaching a small child to build walls with stubbornness instead of asking for bread. It was an infant wound that later hardened into pride. She told herself she had earned everything with discipline and a careful eye. Wealth, she had decided, was a language that clarified boundaries. Her son Javier had left years ago with promises and a suitcase. The loss was a detail she preferred to keep folded into the back of her chest. She spoke rarely of him and never of the boy who once knocked at her gate asking for work with palms out and shoes too thin. Those were distances she liked to store neatly. In the days that followed the water incident, Lupita moved through ordinary rhythms. She had known hunger and she had known shame. She tacked them together with a kind of practical courage. When Doña Refugio, an elderly woman with flour-stained hands and a heart that never quite learned to say no, happened to invite Lupita in for a cup of coffee, that was how chance began to arrange itself differently. Refugio's house smelled of baking, and she had the sort of laugh that softened sentences. She watched Lupita's hands as they fixed a child's torn shirt and saw how careful they were. "Would you come by tomorrow?" Refugio asked one evening, peering over her glasses. "I need someone to wash, to cook. I cannot keep up the way I used to, and besides, I could use company." Lupita, who had been walking back from the market with a child asleep on her shoulder, blinked and said yes before she realized how much it might change things. The job was small in payment but large in dignity. It taught her the delicious oddity of being given a place to belong. She worked afternoons, sweeping the floor that echoed of old memories, boiling beans until they let go of their starchy perfume, folding napkins with the care of someone practicing gentleness. There was no pretense at the house. Refugio paid in honest coins and in conversation. Doña Che, who ran a tiny stall of fruit near the plaza, became part of this new, modest scaffolding of support. She cut off the bruised sections of mango and handed them to Lupita for the children. She taught Pedrito to peel an orange without tearing it and winked at Lupita as if to say, "We see you." Those small affirmations were like kindling. They did not light a blaze, but they warmed. The community, in ways invisible to outsiders, began to rearrange the unseen ledger that governed their lives. People noticed things. Other mothers whispered about how Lupita held her head high despite the cold splash. Children began to mimic her patience without knowing why. Neighbors offered to watch the baby for an hour while she cleaned. The initial spectacle began to be replaced by a series of small, steady acts that, over time, would be the thing that mattered most. If there was one place where the geometry of change took shape, it was the market. The market was a place where currency was barter, but also the exchange of stories, where gossip and bread were traded with equal fervor. One morning, while delivering a plate of tamales to Refugio, Lupita saw a knot of people gathered by the fountain. A child had been thrown from a bicycle by a sudden truck horn. He lay still, small as a broken toy, and the air shrank. Without thinking, Lupita pushed through. She had the reflexes of a woman who had learned to keep children safe with a fraction of herself pinned to necessity. She dropped to her knees, cupped the child's face, and calmed his breath. The world narrowed to the rise and fall beneath her hand. Then a mother's scream, a man's barked instructions, a vendor hitting the emergency button for a moto taxi. The market moved like a breathing thing, and people became parts of a larger body helping a crying limb. The child coughed and then hiccuped. By the time the moto taxi had carried them all to the small clinic 2 blocks away, the bystanders were already clapping softly, not for spectacle, but because humanity had done what it was supposed to do, respond. The child's mother wept into Lupita's shoulder and thanked her with words that trembled between gratitude and disbelief. "You saved my boy," she said, the meaning of the sentence widening to something like a benediction. Doña Estela watched the scene unfold from her balcony, the iron rail pressing into her fingers. She had watched before as people moved by need and emergency. Sometimes she called her driver, sometimes she watched from a distance as if private goodness were another item to be inspected and catalogued. This time, however, something different flattened the surface of her composure. The woman at the center of it all, the one she had doused with cold water, was the first hand to reach. Lupita's small, sure gestures cut away at some of the convenient separations Estela had kept between herself and others. An image struck Estela with the force of a staccato thought, a child's life rescued by someone she had tried to humiliate. It lodged like a pebble in the cavity of her certainty. For the first time in a long while, she felt found out, not because the world exposed her material wealth, but because a human reciprocity had appeared where she had expected only retreat. The feeling was awkward and unwieldy. It made old memories move in her chest. That night, as she sat in the house that had always seemed to require an audience, Estela could not sleep. The silence of her rooms pressed on her like a hand. Her mind unearthed images she had shelved. A mother with calloused hands, a child baring its teeth in a laugh, a small bag of coins left on a doorstep. For a woman who had never allowed others to take center stage in her life, this intrusion of feeling felt dangerous. It made her want to reach for the phone and call someone important, to reassert control with an appointment or a gift. Instead, she sat in a chair and felt a fissure open. At the same time, Lupita returned home that evening with a bandaged child in her arms and a story in her mouth that tasted like adrenaline. The children crowded around with the ruthless curiosity of small things. Pedrito wanted to know if he could be a rescuer too. Ramiro, who had come back from an early shift at the market, stood at the doorway with flour on his knuckles, eyebrows raised not with judgment, but with a mixture of worry and pride. "You did good," he said quietly, and that simple praise put color back in Lupita's face. The world went on as if it were used to dislocations. People walked, sold fruit, swept in front of their doors, and argued about which team would win on Sunday. Yet beneath the rhythm, something had begun to change, a loosening of the old roles that had defined them for so long. Actions small and earnest had a way of rearranging social coordinates. When someone participates in goodness, the equation tiptoes toward another possibility. That dignity is not the possession of a few. The next morning, Lupita found a note slid under her door. It was not a bill or a demand, but an invitation written in a careful hand. Doña Refugio asked if she could come earlier to help prepare the breakfast for a small group of elderly neighbors. "They have trouble getting around," the note read, "and I cannot do everything. If you come, bring that patience of yours." Lupita pressed the paper to her chest, feeling a peculiar steadying in her bones. People sometimes handed out food. It was rarer that they handed out a place to stand. The neighborhood, always a web of small economies, began to notice Lupita differently. Not perhaps in the way that mattered to a woman like Estela. There were no applauding headlines. but in the slow work of reputation. Her name began to carry more than the memory of a cold splash. It carried evidence of hands that would not look away. Across the street, Estella watched these changes with an awkward mixture of pique and curiosity. She found herself studying Lupita's days as if perusing a novel she had not wanted to open. Why did this woman keep moving forward? Who had taught her that humility did not equal surrender? Estella did not easily permit questions to disturb her interior order, but some questions had the persistence of rain. A week later, the market's buzz shifted toward a different rumor. A small boy was missing after school. A toddler slipped out of a gate and might have wandered toward the canal. The community stirred. Mothers grabbed their keys like talismans. Lupita, who had been scrubbing pans at Refugio's house when the news reached her, dropped the brush and ran. The neighborhood's system of care moved in its orderly way. Neighbors paired up, the bell at the church rang for volunteers, and someone began to write the mother's name on the wall in chalk, as if names could anchor worry. Lupita found the boy near the canal, stuck between a low fence and a pile of discarded boxes, eyes wide and small hands clutching a toy car as if it were an anchor. She crawled into the narrow space, soot on her knees, and scooped the child into her arms. The mother collapsed around them, a bundle of sobs and gratitude. The rescue became an image the neighborhood would replay in plate conversations for days. Not because it was spectacular, but because it exposed the simple courage of a person who refused to look away. Doña Estella watched this too, and something inside her could no longer be rationalized. She put down her glass and did something she would not have expected of herself. She opened the balcony door and leaned out. Up close, she could see the dirt at Lupita's nails, the way her lips moved in small murmured comforts to the rescued child. There was firmness in Lupita, a steadiness, not born of indifference, but of necessity and love. It was an image that traveled across a chasm Estella had been nursing for decades. That night, in a house that cultivated sensations rather than relationships, Estella found herself roused by an odd sensation. Not quite a pang, not quite a memory. She made tea and held the cup like a talisman. The house around her seemed unseasonably loud, as if the floors were whispering. On a whim, she opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph, a blurred image of a boy with laughter like a bird. She had kept it folded like a secret. Her fingers trembled, not with regret, but with an unguarded ache that had nowhere to go. Meanwhile, Lupita's life continued in the rhythm of small mercies. She came to Refugio's each morning, and while cooking, found the days arranged into patterns of surprising grace. She would fold towels that smelled of lemon and leave them in a neat pile, take the last of the warm bread to a neighbor who could not get out, and return home with her spirit slightly less bruised than before. There was dignity in the work. There was also a growing recognition that kindness was a kind of currency that multiplied when spent. The stage, then, seemed prepared for a collision of some kind, less a dramatic clash and more a moral reflecting where one life's choices would mirror back to another. People often like to imagine such moments in extremes: thunder on a rooftop, lightning and a voice. Life, however, tends to produce frontalities in softer measures. A look that holds, a hand that refuses to withdraw, a child's cry that redraws the map of responsibility. And perhaps that is why, when the body finally declared its limits, the moral consequence would be unmistakable. On a clear afternoon, after a small procession of errands and conversations, Doña Estella sat alone on her terrace, the sun cutting the marbles into bright, honest plains. She brooded over the photograph in her lap. The effort of trying to keep control of her emotions made her breath shallow. She had taken to walking slowly, as if movement itself could rearrange thought. The day was ordinary. The air carried the distant clamor of the market. Then, with no fanfare, her hand moved to her chest. It was a small, involuntary gesture, a concession her body made before her mind could protest. The photograph slipped from her fingers onto the chair beside her. Her breath caught.
At first it was a tightening, then a sharpness that took the breath from her. The world tilted as if someone had nudged its axis. Inside the house, a maid heard the thud and rushed out, voice sharp with alarm. People appeared in the courtyard like lightning, a neighbor yelling for an ambulance, a driver sprinting for keys, the concierge banging on doors. A commotion rippled through the building. Someone called her name and went to the staircase. Lonely houses are not meant for the suddenness of illness. The polished floors and the imported lamps offered no remedy. Across the street, as news leapt from mouth to mouth like a wildfire of worry, Lupita was sweeping in Refugio's kitchen when a boy from the market burst in with breathless words. "Estella, she's fallen! She's upstairs! She's not moving!" For a second, Lupita's world narrowed to a line between where she stood and that pallid balcony. The image of the woman who had thrown water at her a week ago flashed like an ember. There were reasons to stand back. There were calculations people make in an instant. This woman had turned her face away. Why risk one's neck? But there were also other calculations, older ones, lodged in the soft tissue of the heart. What you do with the vulnerable matters more than what they did to you. Lupita set down her broom. She did not run because she wanted gratitude. She ran because what had happened to the child at the market had shown her what could happen when someone did not look away. She ran because the neighborhood had taught her that human life is not measured by social rank. She ran because somewhere in the meeting of water and child's cry, a new grammar of responsibility had been forming. When she reached the building, the sight of the ambulance lights made a blue line across the street. Doña Chuy pushed through the crowd as if she had pressed a button marked courage. Refugio, trembling but determined, followed with a small bag of towels. The building smelled now not of opulent polish, but of fear. Estella lay on the floor of her terrace room, the photograph face down, a slight curl to her fingers as if clinging to some memory that wanted to be remembered.
Her breaths were shallow, the sounds a small human thing in the quiet expanse of her well-appointed room. Neighbors looked at one another, and in that silent exchange, something shifted. The woman who had once delighted in making a point with cold water was now an object of immediate need. For a brief, luminous second, the social ledger was upended. Then Lupita pushed forward, not with a hesitance, but with the kind of resolve stitched from the days she had known real risk. She knelt beside Doña Estella, felt for a pulse, and pressed a hand to the tremor she could find. The ambulance men worked quickly, and for a moment time folded itself into an intimacy no money could buy. As they lifted Estella onto a stretcher, her eyes fluttered and fixed on Lupita's face. In that fragile stare there was something like recognition, not of status, but of the life that now held hers for a fragile while. Doña Estella's lips parted, forming words that were too soft to carry across the siren's wail. But the expression on her face, something between fear and a dawning shame, was loud. Outside, the neighborhood watched the ambulance recede. People murmured among themselves, each taking inward the sight of the woman who had splashed water being escorted away on a stretcher. The image had weight. Humiliation had been replaced by the ultimate kind of exposure, vulnerability. In a community where everyone knew something of brokenness, the sight was a reminder that no one was beyond need. Only later, as the ambulance lights vanished into the distance, did the true disquiet set in for many. That small moment of vulnerability had stirred a question people did not often like to raise aloud. How do you treat another when their power slips? It was a moral mirror none of them had asked to hold, but which now reflected their faces back with startling clarity. And then, as the evening settled, as lamps glowed behind curtains and soup simmered across the neighborhood, a thought moved through a few people like a soft current. What had happening, in truth, was not merely medical. It was a confrontation of conscience in slow motion. It was as if something, call it mercy, call it justice,
call it the presence of a higher naming, had come in the shape of a hand that refused to be indifferent. Not a voice from the clouds, but a hand in the street. Not a thunderclap, but an insistence that people must do for one another what no position of wealth or poverty should excuse them from doing. Lupita sat on the stoop for a long time after the ambulance left. The cushion of the night lay around her, warm and forgiving. Her hands were still damp from the small tasks of the day. She thought of the child she had helped at the market, of the water, of the photograph fallen beside a woman who now lay in the emergency ward. She thought of the way the neighborhood had shifted, how kindness often traveled in increments, how the smallest of choices could become the hinge of a greater turning.
She did not know the end of what had begun. She could not imagine the recovery or the reconciliations that might grow from this strain of pain. But she knew, with the exact clarity of a woman who has stood at the edge of things long enough to understand the terms of courage, that the next step was always between the impulse to recoil and the choice to serve. For Lupita, that choice had already been taken for days. It only needed a name to make it sacred. It was not thunder that had confronted Doña Estela. It was a series of hands and hearts, persistent in their compassion, that approached until something within her could no longer hide. If anyone wanted to give that sequence a label, they might say, in a whisper or a prayer, that Christ's confrontation with a proud heart had come, not in the form of a sermon, but in the form of people who would not look away. Lupita followed the ambulance lights until they turned into a smear and then vanished down the avenue. Night took back the street in its slow, indifferent way, but the evening had been altered. The next morning arrived with a thin sun and a list of small tasks that refused to be postponed. There were children to dress, a pot to be watched, chores that had an urgency independent of the grander questions that city life sometimes posed. Still, under the routine hummed the memory of a stretcher moving down a stairwell and a shadow of responsibility that would not be shrugged off. At the clinic, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and overbrewed coffee. Lupita sat with her hands folded around a paper cup, listening to the murmur of other worries. People arrived in pairs and alone, each carrying an interior weather of hope, fear, fatigue. She thought of the water, of the baby's cry, of the way Estela's face had looked when it fell into fear. She thought, too, of the small rescues, the boy in the market, the child by the canal, that had taught her to move before thinking about social distance. When someone calls for help, you answer, she had learned. This was not a calculation. It was an old rhythm in her bones. Doctors came and went with faces that slid between professional reserve and cautious optimism. Estela had suffered a myocardial infarction, one of those abrupt betrayals the body sometimes performs. There was talk of tests, of stents, and of careful monitoring. It was medical, technical, and stubbornly ordinary. A series of procedures and medicines that would require time and steadiness to work. There would be rehabilitation, there would be appointments, there would be days when hope felt thin, and other days when it thickened with small improvements. When the doctor finally allowed one visitor at a time, Refugio and Doña Chue insisted on going together and arriving early. The corridor smelled faintly of lemon from Refugio's handkerchief. They asked the staff with the mixture of formality and tenderness that only people who have been in waiting rooms for decades know how to wield. They told the nurse, quietly, that Estela had no family present and asked what could be done. The nurse gave them a look that folded gratitude into relief. "We will do what we can. There are social workers, but right now she needs someone who will stay." Lupita did not brandish credentials. She had stumbled into the clinic with only a flat certainty, that the woman who had thrown water might die, and that, where she could, she would not let that happen without hands. Doña Chue pressed a small paper into her palm, money for bus fare, and Refugio squeezed her shoulder with a softness that said more than words. Go, she said, and do not listen to the small voice that will tell you to stay away. Inside the hospital room, Estella's face was softer than Lupita had ever seen it. The lines carved by time and habit were still there, but they lay like a map instead of an accusation. Machines whirred with steady patience. A nurse adjusted the blanket. Lupita sat by the bedside with both hands folded together, feeling the place where fear and pity and perhaps something like mercy met. Estella opened her eyes and for a moment could see nothing but the whiteness of ceiling tiles. Then her gaze found Lupita's hands. There was a flash of something, recognition perhaps, a recalculation. Words came out in a small, disoriented stream. "You," she tried. "What are you?" Lupita answered simply, not with a sermon nor with a speech, but with the kind of practical tenderness she had learned among bowls and brooms. "I stayed," she said. "You needed someone." She smoothed the blanket at Estella's shoulders with a careful hand, a gesture that refused to mark the past as a category to be argued, but instead treated the present as a place to act. At first, Estella's pride pushed back in odd, brittle flares. She had been raised to manage optics and to keep an inner life under careful lock. To have a woman she had humiliated approach her with a towel felt like a new form of exposure. She would apologize, she thought. She would fix the error with money or gestures. But with each hour and each small act, Lupita bringing a cup of cool water, refolding her pillow, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead, the calculation changed. The currency being exchanged was not cash or gestures. It was humility and service. There were visits from neighbors, some tentative, some blunt as if testing a taboo. Doña Chue arrived with a bag of mangoes and a face that refused to let pity be shameful. Refugio brought a thermos of broth and stories that had the exact right tenderness to soften a hospital bed. A few days passed, and the monitors clicked through rhythms of recovery. Estella opened up in spurts. Her breath shortened when she spoke of her son, and a tremor would run across her face when she reached the memory of the boy who once left with a suitcase and never truly returned. The first admission of fault was small and practical rather than theatrical. She reached for Lupita's hand one afternoon and asked, "Why are you doing this?" The question was not angry but honest in its bewilderment. Lupita looked at Estella the way she looked at a child with a fever, calm, direct, unafraid. "Because it's what we do," she said. "We take care. We don't keep scores." Her voice held no triumph, only the flattened, steady conviction of someone who had seen lives saved by simple compassion. "When you were afraid, someone might have held you. I am holding now." Those words landed in Estella with strange force. The armor that had kept her steady for years cracked in fine, dangerous places. At night she lay awake thinking of a child of her own, a son she had called Javier, who had once chased promises and found rough edges instead. She had kept his absence like a jewel locked away, polished with rationalizations. He had choices. She had done all she could. Wealth had its place. Lying in the hospital, with the world pared down to breathing and machines, and the small kindness of people with flour on their hands, she felt for the first time the reality of what absentee love had cost. News travels in small towns and in large blocks of flats alike. Javier heard of his mother's collapse through the same channels neighbors used to spread worry. Calls, whispers, a message from a neighbor who had once worked with him. The news struck him with the strange, double-edged quality of someone who had lived away from his family and also had not escaped the memory of certain obligations. He had been on and off roads that always seemed to double back on themselves. 3-month stints at a job, comfortable crates of sobriety that often dissolved into the soft pressure of old cravings. The years had layered themselves into apologetic texts and missed birthdays. When he arrived at the hospital, he did not knock with solid confidence. He moved like a man who had learned how to hide, his shoulders hunched, his eyes a little too eager to avoid the gaze of other people. He had the gaunt look of someone who had taken too many small fires into the chest and tried to extinguish them alone. He slid into the waiting room, hands deep in pockets, his voice soft when someone called his name. It was an awkward entrance, the kind that scrapes against pride and regret. When Javier met his mother's gaze, a kind of honest humiliation came over him, one that had nothing to do with the street's judgments and everything to do with private failings. He mouthed an apology that had been rehearsed on nights of drink and rags of guilt, then let out a sound that was nearly a sob. Estella's expression softened in a way that small, brittle pride could not learn to mimic. For a moment, they were a mother and a son in a very old and tender script. Two imperfect people reaching across a gap made of years. "You should have called," she said, not accusingly, but as if placing a fact on the table. Her voice carried an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the hospital bed and everything to do with the seasons that had passed. "I know," Javier answered. He swallowed. "I was afraid I didn't want to make it harder." The admission broke a pattern. It was not a confession in the dramatic sense, it was a small fracture of truth. Tears came unexpectedly to Estella, which surprised her as much as anyone. She reached across the space, and for once the gesture had no calculated weight. It was a hand moving toward a child she had missed. Lupita watched from a little distance, feeling in her chest the strange, high warmth of Mercy's landing. She could see in Javier a man who carried his own wounds, addictions, and the shame that often accompanies them. She could also see the possibility of repair that often sits quiet under rubble. People who decide, in small, repeated acts, to become a different kind of presence in one another's lives. The days that followed were an education in the slow mechanics of change. Estella's recovery required patience. Even after the immediate danger passed, she moved cautiously through tasks that had once been effortless to her. The doctor recommended a program for cardiac rehabilitation, gentle exercise, dietary adjustments, medications. But there were inward things a chart did not measure: the erosion of pride, the tremor of shame, the way one learns to look others in the eye after having used them as props. Javier's presence in the hospital changed the dynamics of the family in palpable ways. He did not arrive as a triumphant return. He arrived as a man who needed help and was, for the first time in a long while, willing to accept it. The first weeks were jagged with old habits and new appointments. Padre Miguel, who had served as a local priest and a quiet mediator for years, brought a practical pragmatism to the table. He suggested a program that combined counseling, group therapy, and steady work. "There is no miracle that skips the work," he said to Javier, with a tenderness that was not mawkish. "There is something steadier needed, the kind of daily scaffolding that stops you from falling back." The community rallied in ways that surprised even its own skeptics. Doña Chuy offered Javier a chance to work at her stall, early mornings, lifting crates, counting coins. She did not ask for promises he couldn't keep. She offered a regular place for him to appear and be accounted for. Refugio called an old acquaintance at a community center and arranged for Javier to meet with a counselor the next week. Ramiro, who had never met Javier but had watched his wife care for Estella with steady hands, offered small things, an extra pair of work boots, a simple plate of stew, and spoke to Javier with the kind of fatherly bluntness that comes from knowing how precarious work can be. The rehabilitation was not cinematic. There were evenings when Javier would stand outside the meeting hall and tremble, courageous and terrified at the same time. There were mornings when he took bus after bus to attend a job interview and came back with a small triumph, a day of work that paid and a new rhythm to hold. There were relapses, moments where a bottle or an old supplier threatened to drag him back. And there were consolations, a sister in the group hugging him, a counselor reminding him of small victories. The community's help did not erase the struggle. It turned it into something manageable by redistributing the weight. While Javier worked at regaining his footing, the hospital became a classroom for a different kind of education. Estella began to tell stories, short, halting snapshots of a childhood that was not as neat as she had convinced herself it was. The stories had names for the things she had buried: hunger that taught a child to hide feelings, a mother who had learned not to ask for help, a boy who left because it was easier than staying and apologizing. She confessed, in small ways, to Lupita and to those who sat with her, that she had used her distance as a measure of worth, and the distance had become an enemy she did not know how to undo. The confession was not theatrical. It came in the clumsy, honest language of someone who had used the tools available to her, money, organization, secrecy, to keep the world at a particular angle. "I thought I was protecting myself," she said one afternoon, her voice raw. "I thought if I kept everything organized, I could keep what mattered safe. But what I kept safe were the measures that kept others out." Lupita did not immediately offer absolution. There was a delicate moral economy in their exchanges. Instead, she offered something more useful: presence and a model. She was a living argument that one could serve without needing to erase the past. "You can make it right by what you do next," she told Estella. "That is the thing people remember. People do not keep a tally forever. They remember when someone came back and stayed." The pivot from remorse to practical restoration took shape in gestures rather than proclamations. Estella began by asking simple, awkward questions. Could she help fund food deliveries? Could she cover a medical bill for a neighbor who could not pay? Could she volunteer some of the old rooms in her house to provide a place for a family who needed it? These were not extravagant gestures in the moral currency of the community. They were attempts to align resources with need. For someone who had once held tight to propriety, the act of untying a purse string with humility felt like a small crucible. The first concrete step was modest. Estella wrote a check to cover Javier's initial rehabilitation costs. She did it without fanfare and without trumpeting charity. When Lupita protested, "We didn't ask for anything," she said with a reflexive dignity, Estella only answered, "Then let me learn to be better at giving." The exchange was clumsy and honest. A woman of means trying to unlearn an old posture, a woman of few resources trying to preserve dignity while accepting necessary help. As the weeks stretched into months, daily life rearranged itself around new rhythms. Estella's health improved in practical ways. Her strength returned little by little. She could walk the corridor without panting. The medications balanced out the tremors that once stalked her chest. Javier's steps toward sobriety were uneven but real. Meetings attended, days clean to mark on a small calendar he kept, honest conversations that were sometimes humiliating and sometimes redemptive. Lupita's family found a stable pattern. Refugio's kitchen shifted into a small hub of shared labor, Ramiro found more frequent market work through a neighbor's recommendation, and the children, Anita and Pedrito and Carlitos, learned to measure time not only by scarcity, but by small flourishes of safety. What changed the neighborhood in the longer view was not large symbolic acts, but a slow accumulation of habits. Estella began to volunteer in ways that were public and quiet at once. She spent mornings at a community center, teaching a class that was less about technique and more about hospitality. How to fold a napkin, how to set a table with dignity, how to listen without turning a story into leverage. She wrote a small check and then another. She sold a property she had kept as a symbol and rerouted the funds to create a fund to help families with medical bills and short-term housing. She did not do it for applause. She did it because the act of giving reshaped the edges of her life. There were moments when old instincts reared up. She would catalog the names of those she helped, a habit left from years of managing lists. Lupita gently corrected her one afternoon, saying, "Names are not receipts, they are people." The correction landed with a humility that looked like patience. Estella learned slowly to let gestures stand without balance sheets. The act of giving became for her a kind of re-education. One afternoon, in a small meeting hall that smelled of coffee and paper, the community decided to formalize something that had simmered for a while: a comedor comunicario, a community kitchen where neighbors could gather for a meal and a place of warmth. The idea was not new, but what made it different this time was who was steering it: a woman who had been a symbol of exclusion, a woman who had once thrown water across a street, now organizing volunteers with a list and a stern, efficient kindness. Doña Estela stood at the front with a clipboard and a tentative smile. The kitchen would be simple: a refurbished room in the building that had once been a reception area, a small budget from Estela's fund, and labor donated by neighbors. Refugio would manage the cooking rotation. Doña Chuy would supply fruit and taught the children how to peel and distribute. Lupita would coordinate childcare on the days the kitchen served. Javier, who had by then been a steady presence in sober meetings for months, would come early to help clean and stack chairs. The project was practical, not utopian. It aimed to provide 2 meals a week and an open pantry for emergency needs. On the opening day, the kitchen hummed with a kind of makeshift joy. Neighbors came with plates and expectations, children with questions, volunteers with aprons and willingness. The first pot boiled over with more heat than necessary, and someone joked that the food tasted better when a dish carried the mark of life clumsily made. Estela moved through the crowd like a new kind of hostess, and when she spoke into the small microphone someone had found, her voice betrayed nerves and a rawness that had not been there before. "I once thought that charity was an audience," she said, voice steadying as the room leaned in. "I was wrong. Charity is a meeting. It is a way to show up. I would like this kitchen to be a place where we feed each other and learn to look after each other. It is not my project alone, it is ours." The words landed on quiet applause. People came up afterward to share their gratitude with a woman whose hands now bore calluses from cooking and work rather than only the smoothness of gloves. She took the thanks with a gaze that had been softened by months of seeing what poverty actually looks like: sometimes boring, often dignified, always complicated. In the months that followed, the Comedor became more than an institution. It was a place where stories were traded like loaves, small, nourishing things that people could take with them. There were evenings when someone who had been ashamed would sit and tell of a lost job, and someone else would respond with a name for a place hiring. There were times when an angry man came to complain and left with a bowl and an apology that tasted of humility. More than food, the place offered a template for ordinary reciprocity. Javier found steady, unglamorous work and a routine that kept him grounded. He attended support groups and, importantly, he learned to ask for help without reading every refusal as a verdict. There were relapses, some bruising, but each time he came back to the group, he was accepted without moral lecture and with practical guidance. The community had learned to hold boundaries and to bring people back, not in a naive way, but in a steady adult one. For Lupita, the changes were both practical and inward. The offer that surprised her most came one evening when Estela asked awkwardly, and almost as if testing a new muscle, whether Lupita and her family would consider living in one of the spare rooms of the now partly renovated house. The request was clumsy on purpose. Estela had practiced humility behind closed doors and needed to try it in the open. Ramiro, who had grown used to managing small wins and sleep-starved nights, said nothing grand. He measured the offer with the quiet practicality of someone who had spent years plugging holes in family life. "We would need a place to store the food for the kids," he said with comic specificity, as if testing logistics would make such a big decision less like grace and more like planning. Lupita listened, her face a blend of shock and caution. She had learned to accept kindness while guarding dignity. The idea of moving into the house that had once been a balcony of scorn felt surreal. There were neighbors who said, in hushed disbelief, that she should not accept gifts, that pride must be kept. Lupita weighed the dignity of refusal against the dignity of care her children deserved. She thought of the nights she had lain awake with worry and the bright, steady days that had become her life. In the end, she answered, "We can try it for a while. The children will have space." The decision was practical and life-changing in small ways. The children had room to play on clean floors, nights were quieter. The smell of beans cooking in a bigger pot replaced the aroma of cramped dinners. Estella, for her part, learned household routines and how to share space with people who brought muddy shoes into the entryway. She learned, clumsily, to sit at a table with children and to ask how their days had been. It was not always smooth. There were arguments about where to place a pot or how to fold towels. But the shared irritations of proximity taught something neither poverty nor wealth ever had: the necessity of living with the small increases of intimacy that true neighborliness requires. Weeks turned to months. The Commodore served meals. The rehab program kept steady. The neighborhood learned to distribute care in ways that did not infantilize or sensationalize need. The story that had started with a bucket of water had leaked into other lives, staining them with small acts that made a durable difference. People found work, children attended school more consistently, and the fund enabled small medical procedures that once seemed out of reach. Yet the most profound changes were inside people, subtle and unscannable. Estella waking up in the morning and choosing to walk to the kitchen herself. Javier writing a letter of apology to someone he had hurt years ago and sending it. Lupita accepting help without letting go of her dignity. The taste of these changes was not spectacular. They were the flavor of morning coffee shared, of a pair of boots mended by a neighbor, of a small child who no longer watched his mother with the same sharpened hunger for security. The turning point that the neighborhood would later recall as the moment of confrontation was not a shout or a dramatic single act. It was a sequence of events that, taken together, felt like a moral mirror being held up to a woman who had thought herself safely beyond reproach. One Saturday, the Commodore organized a small community fair to raise funds for a new fridge and to bring neighbors together. There were tamales, music, and a table with second-hand children's books. Estella moved through the crowd with a tray of cups, her hands now steady with the kind of small competence that comes from repetition. A woman approached Estella with a stack of old photographs, family images worn soft at the edges. She remembered, with the surprising boldness of someone who had once been wronged and now had the courage to speak, the first time she had seen Estella throw water. The woman did not speak with venom. She told the story as a witness. "You did something once," she said, holding the photograph like proof, "and we lived with that. That memory taught many of us to watch our neighbors in a certain way." The crowd listened not with accusation, but with the plain curiosity of people who had borne witness to a transformation unfolding. Estella listened, and then, without fanfare and without the desire to perform, she answered. Her voice was low. Those who knew her could detect a shaking that was not entirely physical. "Yes," she said, "I did that, and for that and the rest I am sorry." She did not attempt to explain away her actions. There was no excuse in the simple admission. "I hope in time I can be what I was not. I hope to be of use, to learn how to be humble." Her words were not a theatrically delivered confession. They were a particular kind of contrition, the practical kind that follows recognition and tries to make a new path. The crowd received her with an awkward, generous silence. Someone hugged her. Another person asked if she would join a committee to teach in the kitchen. The small, steady responses were not applause, but invitations to labor alongside others. At that point, many in the neighborhood would later say, something shifted in Estella, as if a presence had stepped into the room, not as a thunderclap, but as a tender insistence. It was as if Jesus himself had confronted her, not with fire and rhetoric, but with the faces of those she had once kept at distance. A woman with flour-stained hands, a mother who had dried a baby's tears,
a son who arrived with complicated guilt and the willingness to change. The confrontation was not a condemnation, but an exposure of the heart's capacity to change when met by patient mercy. Those who watched later remembered the scene as a holy sort of moment, not because lights came down from heaven, but because human contrition and forgiveness are in their own way channels of the divine. Some would urge that that language be used carefully, that God's work is complex and does not always map neatly into human narratives.
But for many of the neighbors, the sense of something greater at work was not a theological claim about miracles, but a moral recognition that the calls for justice and the long, stubborn patience of mercy had finally intersected in a practical life. The result was not instantaneous redemption, but the beginning of a reoriented life. Time continued to shape them. Javier's work stabilized. He married his sobriety to a careful schedule and a new set of relationships grounded in accountability. He met with a counselor each week and volunteered for a youth program aimed at keeping others from making his mistakes. He and Estella repaired parts of the relationship that knots had torn. There were no dramatic reconciliations in a single scene. Instead, there were dinners taken together, bills paid with shared responsibility, and a slow, honest rebuilding of trust. Estella became a steady donor to the fund she had created. She set up a small scholarship for children in need of school supplies and a microloan scheme for neighbors who wanted to open stalls at the market. Her house, once a symbol of isolation, became a place of comings and goings, a room for a visiting volunteer, a place for Thursday night meetings, a tiny library of donated books for children. She learned to accept the awkward gratitudes of people she had once measured as beneath her. The gestures became, day by day, the work of a new habit. Ramiro's life found an easier rhythm with the security of a slightly larger kitchen and the occasional income from community work. The small house felt fuller, not crowded, but inhabited with the kind of noise that means life is present. Anita's braids seemed even more meticulous now, a visible sign that children, when given small amounts of security, luxuriate in care. Pedrito's daring turned into a boundless curiosity for the world that the neighborhood encouraged rather than scolded. Carlito's crew, his laugh lighting up rooms as if nothing had ever happened. Not everything smoothed out. Old resentments surfaced sometimes in unhelpful ways. People argued about how to allocate funds. Someone mismanaged an order of supplies and had to explain themselves. There were days when the city would remind them of structural problems. Insufficient health services, a bureaucracy that misplaced records, jobs that paid as little as a day's market toil. But those were the kinds of problems that a single act of charity could not cure. What the neighborhood had created, however, was a mechanism for meeting those challenges. A fund, a network, a kitchen that doubled as a hub for mutual aid. Years later, when someone in the area wanted to tell the story in short form, a version broadcast in a church foyer or over a family table, people tended to compress the arc into a single memorable line. A rich woman threw water at a poor mother, and a week later she was carried into the ambulance. That was the day everything began to change. The shorthand hid the complexity of months and years of labor. The clinic appointments, the group meetings, the evenings when someone relapsed and came back, the steady running of a kitchen that fed dozens each week. In private, Estella carried a quieter story. She kept a small notebook where she wrote a sentence each night about what she had learned. The sentences were simple. Today, I sat with a mother and listened. Today, I let Javier take care of the car. Today, I asked for help and it arrived. They were not dramatic confessions. They were ledger entries of a moral life being rewired. She attended church sometimes, not out of a sudden conversion, but because she found there the company of people practicing mercy. When she prayed, small, private mutterings in the dark, her words were practical and human. "Help me to be useful," she whispered once. And then another night, "Forgive me for the times I chose distance." People who knew the neighborhood's story best would sometimes debate whether it was correct to say that Jesus confronted her. Some insisted that the language was not literal but poetic. Others said it was the only way to name the moral pressure that had forced a change. Someone at the Comedor would put it simply. It was Jesus, not the kind with thunder, but the kind that shows up as people who will not look away. The metaphor held because it matched a lived experience. When mercy refuses to be neutral and insists on proximity, it changes the ledger of a life. The forced humility in Estella's life became, paradoxically, a kind of blossoming. She discovered that giving could be a discipline rather than a performance. She learned to listen to other people's stories without measuring them against an internal barometer. Each revelation came with a price, a painful memory, an apology, the adjustment of old habits, but also with an expansion of what her days meant. In the end, the neighborhood telling of events shaped a broader lesson. Justice and grace arrive in forms that are human and patient. There was no theatrical thunderclap, no instantaneous miracle. There was instead a sequence of persistent kindnesses that reconstructed a social fabric. The image of Jesus confronting a proud heart held because it did not rely on the spectacular. It relied on the quiet insistence of neighbors who choose again and again to be present. On an ordinary afternoon, some years after the water had struck the shawl and sent a baby's wail across the street, the Comedor held a small celebration. A banner with faded letters announced the anniversary. There were tamales and music and children running in circles. Estella moved through the crowd and, when she saw Lupita, crossed the room and simply hugged her. It was not a grand gesture. It was a hands-on, honest embrace that spoke of years of cooking together, of nights at hospital bedsides, of awkward apologies and patient forgiveness. "You were the first one who kept it simple," Estella said into Lupita's shoulder. "You taught me how to do it." Her voice cracked at the end, and no one pretended it was anything other than what it was. A woman acknowledging that her life had been altered by someone she had once tried to humiliate. Lupita smiled in a way that balanced the deep reserve of a woman who had kept a family with the generous heart of someone who had learned to help without expectations. "You learned," she said. "We all learned." The crowd hummed with the ordinary sounds of a place in motion. Plates clinking, children squealing, the soft scraping of chairs. The air held, too, a quiet note of sacredness that had nothing to do with sermons and everything to do with simple, repeated goodness. At the end of the day, Estella went to the small room she had kept for others and sat by a window. She looked out over the neighborhood, where gutters now had small plants in them, where laundry fluttered like flags of a modest victory, and thought of the photograph that had once slipped from her hand. She thought of her son and of how he had come back not as a conquering hero, but as a man willing to do the long work of restoration. She marveled quietly at the way life, when real hands are involved, finds new arrangements. In a prayer that was private and not showy, she said aloud something that was both confession and thanksgiving. "If that was you, Lord, if that was how you came to me, thank you. If that was only us, then thank you all the same." The sentence held both humility and reverence, a small witness to the way divine things often arrive in human forms. The story that began with a bucket of water did not end in a tidy tableau. There were still problems, jobs that paid too little, a health system that demanded patience, nights when old insecurities surfaced. But there was a new baseline, a network of people who would not look away. The neighborhood had rewritten itself into a place of mutual care. Years later, when a visitor asked Lupita how she explained the turn of events, how she could forgive, how she could choose service, she answered with a simplicity that carried the weight of lived experience. "It wasn't easy," she said. "It started with not letting other people's mean acts become the limit of what I could do. Someone once helped me when I thought I didn't deserve it. The thing keeps going when people do the next right thing. That's how change works here. And when that visitor met Estella, who now spent time teaching a class at the Comedor and had stopped wearing gloves as if to protect herself from life, Estella would say, with a softness that used to be missing from her voice, "There is a way God comes in, through hands, through stubborn kindness. It is not the drama we sometimes expect, but it is real. It confronted me like the weight of my own life pressing back. I learned to answer." If the neighborhood ever wanted to give the whole sequence a single tidy moral, they might say, when pride meets mercy and the mercy insists on proximity, something like redemption can begin. It is not a theological neatness, but a lived practice, a series of small acts that, together, reconfigure a life. The bucket of water remained in the memory like a catalyzing image, a flash of cruelty that set a long chain into motion. But what people remembered most were the hands that followed, the towel pressed gently, the shoulder offered at a hospital bed, the community kitchen that fed dozens, the son who learned to ask for help, the woman who revised her life. Those hands, the neighborhood agreed, were the instruments of something larger than themselves. And so the street kept going. Children grew, meals were served. Pain was met with errands and appointments and small acts of attention. When someone fell, someone else ran. The rhythm of giving and receiving became less of a moral drama and more of a lived habit. In those habits, many found a kind of quiet holiness, not the cinematic miracle of sudden transformation, but the steady miracle of people learning to be better at being human together. If anyone asked whether Jesus had really confronted Doña Estela, the simple response from those who lived there would be, yes, not with thunder, but with a woman who would not look away, with a son who returned to try, with a community that learned to take responsibility. It was a confrontation that manifested in compulsion to serve, in the refusal to let past cruelty define future action, and in the humility of a woman deciding to turn her resources toward repair instead of distance. At the center of it all stood the quiet figure of a mother with a long list of small mercies, Lupita, who showed that when someone decides to be kind, not for show but out of habit, the world changes in ways no rhetorical sermon could legislate. The end of the story is not a neat finality so much as an invitation. If you see something in your own street that hurts, show up, bring a towel, sit, feed, keep coming. That is the way the divine, if it wishes to be known in our time, often chooses to make itself known. Share this story with someone who needs hope. If it moves you, consider helping a local food bank or volunteer where people gather. Small, steady actions change lives.